The morning sun was soft that day, spreading golden light across the quiet town. Birds were calling from the trees, and the air smelled fresh after a short night of rain. At the edge of the small community stood a simple wooden house with a worn porch and a neatly cut lawn. It was the kind of place no one paid much attention to, except for the man who lived there and his loyal dog who never left his side. He lived a life so quiet that most people barely noticed him. He spoke politely when needed, waved to his neighbors, and spent his mornings walking along the dirt road that ran past the woods. People thought he was just another older man enjoying his retirement, someone who preferred peace and solitude. Few knew that behind his calm eyes and steady walk was a history filled with missions that never made the news and battles fought far from home. His dog was everything to him. It was a large, strong animal with soft brown fur and intelligent eyes. The dog followed him everywhere, always alert but gentle with those who meant no harm. They had been together for years from the moment he adopted it as a small pup. For him, the dog wasn't just a pet. It was a companion that helped him find peace after years of chaos. When nightmares woke him up in the middle of the night, the dog would rest its head on his chest, grounding him back to reality. Every morning he followed the same routine. He brewed a pot of black coffee, filled a metal bowl for his dog, and then set out on their morning walk before sunrise. The world was still half asleep at that hour, and he liked it that way. He liked hearing the sound of the dog's paws against the road and the soft breeze through the trees. Those small moments made him feel alive. Neighbors often saw him walking quietly, his hand sometimes resting on the dog's back. Children would wave and he would smile softly in return. Some of the kids were a little scared of the dog at first because of its size, but the man would always tell them, "He's a good one. He just looks serious." And he was right. The dog never hurt anyone. It was disciplined, well-trained, and loyal to the core. But behind this simple life, there were moments when his eyes would drift to the horizon as if searching for something that only he could see. Sometimes he would sit on the porch at night silent for hours, staring into the dark. The sound of crickets and the steady breathing of the dog beside him were the only things that reminded him that he was home, not out there somewhere far away. His past was not something he spoke about. Those who had known him for years had learned not to ask. He had once been a part of something much larger, a unit that operated in silence and shadows, taking on missions no one else could handle. He had seen things that stayed buried in his memory, things he carried quietly. The only way he found peace was through the simplicity of daily life and the company of his four-legged friend. One afternoon, as he was fixing the fence near his yard, the dog lay under the shade, watching him. A mail carrier walked by and the dog barked once, not in aggression but in alertness. The man called it back calmly and the dog obeyed immediately, sitting beside him. The mail carrier smiled nervously, saying, "That's a big one you've got there." "He's all heart," the man replied with a faint smile. "Wouldn't hurt a soul." That small interaction would later become something people in the town would recall when everything changed. The following week, a new family moved into the neighborhood. They didn't know much about anyone there, and they seemed a little nervous about the quiet nature of the area. Their young son often played outside, and whenever the dog barked from across the fence, the mother would rush to pull her boy inside. She didn't understand that the bark wasn't a threat. It was simply how the dog greeted anyone who came near. One morning, while the man was out running an errand, the dog managed to slip out of the gate. The latch hadn't closed properly after he left, and a gust of wind pushed it open. The dog trotted down the road, curious and free, sniffing the air and wagging its tail. It didn't go far, just near the edge of the woods where the man usually walked it. A passerby who didn't know the animal saw it from a distance and got frightened. They thought it was a stray. The large frame and sharp alertness made it look intimidating, even though it wasn't. They quickly called local authorities, reporting a dangerous-looking dog roaming freely near the houses. By the time the officers arrived, the dog was sitting calmly under a tree, watching birds overhead. It wagged its tail when the car pulled up, expecting to see its owner. But the officers, unfamiliar with the situation and tense from the report, saw the dog differently. One of them opened the door slowly, calling out to it. The dog tilted its head and barked once. The sudden bark startled them. Meanwhile, a few neighbors stepped outside, curious about the noise. Some tried to explain that the dog belonged to the quiet man who lived down the road. but the officers seemed too focused on handling what they believed was a potential threat. As one of the officers stepped closer, the dog stood up, tail wagging, but its size and stance gave the wrong impression. The situation escalated too quickly, and what should have been a calm resolution turned into something tragic. When the man returned home that afternoon, he noticed the gate open. His heart sank immediately. He called out for his dog, his voice steady but filled with worry. He walked down the path they always took together, calling again and again. Then he saw the flashing lights ahead near the road. His pace quickened. What he found there would change everything. The sight stopped him in his tracks. The air seemed to freeze. A group of officers stood near their vehicle, talking quietly among themselves. Neighbors were gathered at a distance, their faces full of sadness and shock. And there, lying still, was his dog. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply stood there, staring. The world around him went silent. For a man who had faced explosions, gunfire, and chaos overseas, nothing had ever hit him quite like that moment. An officer stepped forward and tried to speak, explaining that they had no choice, that they believed the animal was aggressive. But the man barely heard the words. He kneeled beside his dog, placing a hand on its fur, still warm from the sun. His eyes didn't show anger, only deep pain, a quiet, heavy kind of pain that comes when something pure is lost. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some saying the officers didn't know whose dog it was, others saying it was a mistake that should never have happened. Someone placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but he didn't move. He stayed there until the crowd slowly disappeared and the officers drove away. That night, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. The bowl in the kitchen was still half full, the leash hung by the door, and the silence was unbearable. He sat on the porch with his head in his hands, feeling the weight of memories pressing against his chest. In his mind, he replayed years of missions, how every decision he made used to be about saving lives, not taking them. He had seen men risk everything for the sake of loyalty. His dog had been the same, loyal to the end. And now that loyalty had been met with misunderstanding. He couldn't sleep that night. The memories of the past mixed with the grief of the present. The discipline that had guided him through years of service was now the only thing keeping him from falling apart. In the following days, people in the neighborhood came to express sympathy. Some brought food, others offered to help. The man thanked them softly, but he rarely said much. He kept to himself, visiting the small patch of ground near the woods where he buried his companion. Every morning he'd stand there quietly, as the sun rose, and whisper something only he could hear. What the townspeople didn't realize was that the man they saw as a quiet retiree had once been part of an elite force known for precision, discipline, and control. He had been trained to handle impossible situations, to stay calm under pressure. But nothing had prepared him for this kind of loss. While he never raised his voice or showed anger, there was a storm building inside him, not a violent one, but a determined one. He didn't seek revenge. He sought understanding. He wanted answers, not for himself, but for the memory of his friend who had never hurt anyone. The man's quiet presence began to draw attention. People started to ask questions about the incident, about why no one had checked who the dog belonged to before taking action. Some whispered that the man had once served in a special military unit, though no one knew details. Others said he had seen things that made him value life more than anyone could imagine, but he never corrected them. He simply stayed silent, his actions speaking louder than words. Each day that passed, he carried himself with the same calm strength he had always shown, even as grief sat heavy on his shoulders. Late one evening, as the town quieted again, he stood on his porch looking toward the road. The air was cool and the sky was full of stars. For a long time, he just stood there, hands in his pockets, thinking about the life he once lived and the one he lived now. The world had changed around him, yet in that moment, he realized something that would guide what came next. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could decide what it would mean. And from that quiet decision, a new story began to take shape, one that the authorities, and soon the whole town, would come to know. Days passed slowly after that morning. The man woke up each day at the same time out of habit, but the silence in his house felt heavier than before. He would stand by the door for a moment, looking at the empty spot where his dog used to wait for their morning walk. The leash still hung there, and he couldn't bring himself to move it. It was as if removing it would make the loss more real. Outside, life continued as usual. The neighborhood children played, cars passed down the road, and birds sang in the trees. Yet for him, everything seemed distant. Every sound reminded him of what was gone. He kept thinking about that day, replaying every small detail in his mind, searching for something he could have done differently. Maybe if he had fixed the gate earlier or stayed home that morning, none of this would have happened. But deep down he knew it wasn't his fault. It was a mistake, a human mistake that had taken something precious from him. He tried to stay busy. He mowed the lawn, fixed the fence again, and stacked firewood near the porch. But even simple tasks felt empty. The quietness pressed against him until he couldn't bear it. One evening he decided to go for a walk like he used to. The road stretched out under the fading light and the air was cool. He found himself walking toward the spot where everything had happened. There were still faint tire marks on the road where the police cars had parked. He stopped there and took a deep breath, letting the memories wash over him. Some neighbors saw him from their porches but didn't say anything. They understood. They had seen the pain in his eyes that day, the kind that words couldn't touch. A week later, he received a letter from the local animal control office. It was short, formal, and full of official language. They expressed their condolences but also stated that the officers had followed standard safety protocol. Reading those words felt like a punch to the chest. They didn't see his dog as a living being. They saw it as a situation. To them, it was just a line in a report. To him, it was family. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and sat in silence for a long time. He wasn't angry in the way most people expected. His calmness was something different, a quiet strength built from years of discipline. But inside, something had shifted. He realized that the people responsible had no idea what they had done, not just to him but to themselves. They had acted without understanding, and now they had to face the truth. The next morning, he decided to visit the town's administrative office. He didn't plan to argue or cause a scene. He just wanted to talk to someone, to understand how things could go so wrong. When he arrived, the receptionist greeted him politely, not recognizing him. He explained what had happened, and soon he was seated in front of an officer who handled public complaints. The officer looked uncomfortable as he spoke. "Sir, we truly regret the incident, but our team was following proper procedure. The animal was reported as aggressive and they responded accordingly." The man listened quietly, his hands resting on his knees. "Did anyone check whose dog it was before taking action?" he asked softly. The officer hesitated. I believe they tried to, but the situation escalated quickly." He nodded slowly. "So you acted first and asked questions later?" The officer didn't answer. The man stood up, thanked him, and walked out. There was no anger in his voice, but his silence carried weight. That day, word began to spread around town that he had gone to speak to the authorities. Some people thought he was looking for revenge. Others believed he just wanted justice. But those who knew him best understood. He wasn't seeking to harm anyone. He was seeking truth. A few days later, one of the neighbors came to visit him. She brought a small box of cookies and said she wanted to apologize on behalf of the community. "We should have spoken up louder that day," she said with tears in her eyes. "Some of us tried to tell them it was your dog, but they didn't listen." He smiled faintly and told her not to blame herself. "Sometimes people only hear what fear tells them," he said quietly. "That's what makes them act too fast." Her words, though kind, stayed with him. The fact that no one had truly listened made him realize something larger was wrong. It wasn't just about his loss, it was about how quickly fear could blind people. And for the first time in years, the part of him that used to lead others through chaos began to wake up again. That night, he opened an old trunk he hadn't touched in years. Inside were photographs, medals, and folded uniforms. Each item told a story of where he had been and what he had survived. He ran his fingers across one of the patches, faded but still sharp. The letters on it were simple, yet they carried the weight of every mission he had ever taken. Delta Force. He remembered the long nights overseas, the silent missions where one wrong move could cost lives. He remembered the brothers he had lost, the ones who taught him that loyalty and discipline were everything. And he remembered the promise he made to himself when he left that life behind, to never use his skills in anger again. But this situation wasn't about anger. It was about principle. He realized he could use his training not for violence, but for something meaningful, to bring light to what had happened. The next morning, He began gathering information. He wrote down dates, times, names of the officers, and witness accounts from the neighbors. He kept everything neatly organized. It was the same way he used to plan missions, calm, precise, and methodical. He didn't rush. He knew patience was power. When he returned to the administrative office a week later, he brought with him a folder filled with documents and statements. The same officer who had spoken to him before looked nervous when he saw the man return. "I'd like to file an official complaint," the man said calmly, "and I want it to go beyond this office." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see what I can do." Within days, the town started to whisper again. People heard that the quiet man was pushing back. Some supported him. Others said he should just move on. But those who had served in the military and lived in the town understood that this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. One evening, while he was sitting on his porch, a retired police officer came to see him. He had heard about the situation and wanted to talk. The two men sat in silence for a few minutes before the visitor spoke. "I read about what happened," he said softly. "I'm sorry. Sometimes the ones in charge forget that badges don't make people perfect. I hope you find peace in this." The man nodded. "Peace is earned," he said. "And sometimes you have to remind people of what it means." After that conversation, he decided to take his next step carefully. He reached out to a small-town reporter who often covered community issues. The reporter came to his house one afternoon with a notebook and recorder, not knowing what to expect. When the man began to speak, his words were simple and calm. He didn't talk about his past or his military background. He just told the truth, about his dog, the mistake, and the system that failed to listen. The story went public a few days later. It wasn't sensationalized or dramatic. It was honest. People across the town and soon from nearby areas read about it. They began to see the man and his loss in a new light. Many reached out, sending letters and messages of support. Some shared their own stories of similar mistakes, where animals or loved ones were lost because of poor judgment. At first, the authorities ignored the growing attention, but as more people began asking questions, they realized they couldn't stay silent. The local police department released a statement expressing regret and promising to review its procedures. Yet to the man, words were not enough. He wanted to see change, not just hear apologies. One evening, he sat at his kitchen table looking through all the letters and emails he had received. There were messages from strangers thanking him for speaking up, telling him that his story gave them courage to do the same. That touched him deeply. For the first time since the loss, he felt a sense of purpose again. Still, there were nights when the loneliness crept in. He would sit outside and look at the stars, remembering the steady rhythm of paws beside him. Sometimes he swore he could still hear the soft bark echoing in the distance. Those moments reminded him that love doesn't end when life does. It simply changes form. He began spending time helping others in the community. He visited the local shelter, volunteered to train dogs, and taught young officers how to understand animal behavior better. He didn't announce who he was or what he had done in the past. He just quietly shared his experience. People respected him for it even without knowing his full story. But behind the scenes, things were changing. The attention his case received reached higher levels. A regional news station picked it up, and then national outlets began asking questions. Someone eventually discovered his military background and quietly confirmed that he had been part of an elite special operations unit. That revelation changed everything. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. People realized that the man they saw as an ordinary neighbor was someone who had risked his life countless times for his country. The irony was sharp. The authorities who had acted recklessly had unknowingly wronged someone who had spent his entire life protecting others. Yet, he never used his past to intimidate or seek sympathy. When reporters asked about his service, he simply said, "That was another life. I'm just trying to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." That humility struck people deeply. The story became a symbol of calm strength and dignity. It wasn't about anger or blame anymore. It was about compassion, responsibility, and understanding. As more officials began to acknowledge their mistake publicly, the man finally felt a small weight lift from his heart. He knew the pain would never fully go away, but seeing awareness grow brought him some peace. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, he stood at the small grave where his companion rested. The world around him was quiet, bathed in gold light. He placed a small wooden tag on the ground and whispered softly, "We're making it right, buddy. One step at a time." And for the first time in a long while, he felt the wind shift gently, like a sign that his friend was still there, watching, proud. The days turned into weeks, and the story that began as a small local incident had now become something much bigger. People who had never met the man were talking about him. His quiet strength, the way he handled his loss without shouting or anger, touched people across the country. It wasn't the story of revenge, it was the story of calm dignity. But for him, fame meant nothing. He still lived the same quiet way he always had. He woke up early, made his coffee, and went about his day. What had changed, though, was the way people treated him. Neighbors who once waved politely now stopped to talk, offering support or just asking how he was doing. Some brought meals, others offered to help around the house. He appreciated their kindness. But what mattered most to him was that people were beginning to see the truth, not just about what had happened to his dog, but about how easily fear and poor judgment could lead to harm. One morning he received a letter in the mail. It was from someone working in the regional police department. The letter said they had seen the news reports and wanted to personally apologize for how things were handled. They invited him to a private meeting to discuss possible policy changes regarding animal safety. The man read the letter slowly, then folded it neatly. He wasn't sure if he wanted to go. He didn't want to relive the pain, but he also knew that this might be the chance to make something good come from what had happened. After thinking it over for a day, he decided to attend the meeting. He arrived at the office dressed simply as always, plain shirt, jeans, and a calm expression. The officers there seemed nervous when he entered. They had read about his military background by now and treated him with quiet respect. One of them offered him a seat, and the meeting began. They talked for nearly 2 hours. The officers explained their side, the pressures of quick decisions, the fear of getting hurt, the confusion that comes with emergency calls. He listened carefully, not interrupting once. Then when they were done, he spoke. His voice was steady, but every word carried weight. "I understand fear," he said. "I've lived with it. I've seen what happens when people let fear make their choices. But what you call fear is something you can train. You can learn to pause, to think before you act. That's what separates panic from discipline." The room fell silent. None of them looked defensive. Instead, they looked thoughtful. He continued. "My dog wasn't just a pet. He was my partner in peace. He helped me remember that life doesn't always have to be about fighting. When he was taken from me because someone didn't stop to think, it felt like I lost more than a friend. I lost the symbol of everything I had tried to protect all those years ago." His words stayed with them. They promised to start new training programs that would help officers handle animal situations more calmly. He left the meeting feeling lighter, though not completely healed. The pain was still there, but at least now something good was beginning to grow from it. Over the next few months, people kept reaching out to him, reporters, organizations, and even other veterans who had gone through similar pain. He didn't seek attention, but he agreed to a few interviews because he wanted his message to reach further. Each time he spoke with honesty and humility. He told people that strength wasn't about power or reputation. It was about patience and compassion. One interviewer asked him, "How did you stay so calm after losing so much?" He paused before answering. "Because I've seen what anger does," he said softly. "It destroys everything good left in you. I couldn't let that happen again. I chose peace because it's the harder road, and sometimes the hardest things are the ones worth doing." That clip went viral online. People began calling him the man of quiet strength. But for him, the attention was only a reminder that he had a duty now to keep using his story to inspire change. Meanwhile, his small town changed too. The police department introduced new policies for dealing with animals. Officers were trained to identify signs of fear versus aggression, and to use patience first. People started volunteering at shelters and adopting animals. It was as if one man's loss had opened everyone's eyes a little wider. But even as positive things grew around him, the man still had quiet nights where the pain crept back in. Sometimes he'd wake up before dawn, hearing echoes of soft paws that weren't there anymore. The loneliness was something he had learned to live with but never fully overcome. On those mornings, he'd sit outside with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise, and remind himself that grief and love are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. One afternoon, he was invited to speak at a community event for veterans. At first, he didn't want to go. He had always kept his military past private, but the event organizers said it was less about war and more about resilience, how to find peace after hardship. So he agreed. When he stepped on stage, the small crowd went quiet. He didn't have notes or a speech prepared. He just spoke from the heart. "I've spent a lifetime learning how to survive," he began, "but surviving isn't the same as living. You can go through the hardest things in life and still not know what peace means. I didn't find peace through war. I found it through love, through a companion who reminded me how to care again. Losing him hurt more than I can explain, but it also showed me something I'd forgotten. Compassion is the strongest thing a person can have." The audience listened, some wiping away tears. When he finished, there was a long silence before they began to applaud, not because of his words, but because of the truth behind them. After that speech, he began receiving invitations from other towns to share his message. He never accepted money for it. He simply went where he was needed, speaking quietly but powerfully about empathy, patience, and the importance of restraint. People said his voice carried calm even when he spoke about pain, but behind every speech, every kind smile, he still missed his dog deeply. That bond was something that no words could replace. Sometimes, when he drove past the place where it all happened, he'd slow down and whisper a quiet promise to himself, to always act with understanding, no matter how hard life became. As his message spread, the same authorities who once made the mistake started inviting him to help with training programs. He stood in front of rooms filled with young officers, teaching them not how to fight but how to pause and think. One day, during one of these sessions, a young officer asked him, "Sir, how do you stay calm when everything goes wrong?" He smiled gently. "Because I've already seen what happens when calm is lost," he said. Control doesn't come from fear, it comes from clarity. The moment you let fear make your choice, you lose control. Those words stayed with that young officer for years to come. As time went on, the man's life slowly settled into a new rhythm. The attention faded, but his influence didn't. The changes he helped inspire continued to grow quietly, just like he preferred. Some towns began calling their new training programs the gentle approach inspired by his story. He spent his days working on small projects around his house, fixing things, planting a garden, and taking quiet walks in the woods. Sometimes he'd stop at the small resting place where he buried his companion. The wooden tag he had placed there months ago had weathered from the rain, but the words were still visible. He'd brush the dirt off gently and sit there for a while, talking softly as if the dog could still hear him. He often said that grief doesn't disappear. It simply becomes part of who you are, and in his case it became a part that made him better. He had seen too much of what hate and fear could do to the world. Now he wanted to spend the rest of his days spreading the opposite: patience, forgiveness, and calm understanding. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky glowed orange, a reporter came by to interview him again, wanting to write a follow-up story. She asked if he thought justice had been done. He thought for a moment before answering. "Justice isn't always punishment," he said. "Sometimes justice is change. If something good can grow out of pain, then that's enough for me." The reporter smiled and said softly, "You've changed a lot of lives, you know." He shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "I just reminded people of what they already knew. That kindness still matters." That night he sat outside again, listening to the quiet sounds of the night, the rustling of trees, the distant hum of cars, and the whisper of the wind. He looked up at the stars and smiled faintly. For the first time since that terrible day, his heart felt still, not empty, not heavy, just peaceful. He knew he couldn't bring his dog back, but in some strange way, the spirit of that loyal companion still lived on. Every time a police officer paused before making a rash decision, every time someone chose compassion over fear, that spirit echoed quietly in the world. He once said in an interview, "You don't need medals or titles to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is one calm voice in a loud world." And that's exactly what he became, a quiet voice that reminded people that strength isn't about power, but about patience. Years later, when people in the town talked about him, they didn't mention his past in Delta Force. They didn't even talk about the tragedy anymore. They spoke of his calmness, his humility, and the way he turned pain into something beautiful. His story wasn't one of revenge or anger. It was a reminder that even in loss there can be light. And so, the man who once lived in silence became a symbol of grace and understanding. His life moved forward gently, like a river finding its way through rocks, carving a path that would last far longer than any headlines or stories ever could. When word started to spread about who the quiet man really was, the small town changed overnight. What had once been a story about an unfortunate incident with a pet now became something much bigger. People began whispering in grocery stores. Neighbors stood a little longer by their fences, and local reporters started showing up near his house hoping for a glimpse of him. Most people had no idea that the man who lived so quietly down the lane had once served in one of the most secretive military units in the world. For days, he didn't step outside much. He wasn't hiding from anyone. He just didn't want to be part of the noise. He had spent most of his life living quietly, not because he was afraid, but because he preferred peace. Now all that peace was gone. The phone at the town's police department kept ringing. People were asking questions, some angry, some confused. The officers involved in the incident looked uneasy when they came to work. The chief held a few private meetings behind closed doors, and more than once a government vehicle was seen parked outside the station. Someone higher up had clearly taken interest in the case. Inside his home, the man sat at the small wooden table, staring at an old photo of his dog resting by his side. The picture had been taken a few months earlier, during one of their long walks near the lake. He could still remember the quiet splashing of water and the wag of the dog's tail. That memory felt both comforting and painful now. He wasn't angry the way most people thought. Anger was something he had learned to control long ago. What he felt was deeper, an ache that came from betrayal and disbelief. He had seen enough in his life to know that mistakes happen. But this mistake had taken away the one thing that had kept him grounded since leaving the battlefield. One morning, he received a call from someone who introduced herself as an independent journalist. She had been following the story and wanted to hear his side directly. At first, he refused. He didn't want attention or pity, but as the days went by, he realized that staying silent would allow others to twist the truth. So he agreed to meet her not for revenge but for clarity. They met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. She had a small recorder and a notebook. Her tone was gentle, respectful. "People want to understand," she said softly. "They've heard so many versions of what happened. Would you be willing to tell me what's true?" He took a slow breath and nodded. For the next hour he spoke, not about his military service, but about his dog. He talked about how he found him, how the animal had helped him recover from the shadows of war, how he would wake up early just to walk together before the world got noisy. The journalist listened carefully, never interrupting. When she asked about that day, his voice lowered. He didn't describe the scene in detail. He didn't need to. The silence between his words said enough. By the end of the conversation, she was visibly moved. "You know," she said quietly, "this story isn't just about what happened. It's about how people forget that small acts can carry huge consequences." He gave a small nod. "I just want people to learn from it," he replied. "That's all." When her article was published a week later, it spread far beyond the small town. The headline didn't focus on tragedy or anger. It focused on empathy and accountability. Readers across the country shared it, and soon other journalists began reaching out, not to sensationalize the story but to understand it. The growing attention brought pressure on the authorities. The department announced an internal review, though some suspected they had been pushed into it by outside forces. Investigators came and went, and documents were quietly pulled from archives. The officers involved were told to stay off duty until further notice. Meanwhile, he continued to live quietly, though now strangers would sometimes stop by his house to leave flowers or small notes by the gate. One message simply read, "I'm sorry for what you lost." Another said, "Your story changed how I see things." He never met the people who left them, but their kindness reminded him that not everyone acted without thought. One evening, as the sun was setting, he received another visitor. This time, a young police officer he had never met. The man looked nervous as he approached. "Sir," he said carefully, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. I wasn't involved, but it's made a lot of us think differently." The former soldier studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "That's good," he said simply. "Thinking before acting saves lives. It always has." The officer nodded, grateful for the brief exchange, and left quietly. For the first time in weeks, the man felt a small sense of peace. Maybe, he thought, this was how change began, not with noise, but with reflection. As the investigation continued, more details came to light. The call that started it all had come from a neighbor who had mistaken the dog's barking for aggression. The officers who responded hadn't followed full procedure. They hadn't waited for the owner to return or checked with animal control. It was a series of small, careless choices that led to an irreversible result. When these findings became public, people reacted strongly. Some demanded justice, while others argued that mistakes should be forgiven. Through it all, he stayed quiet. He didn't want people to fight in his name. What he wanted was understanding and change. A few weeks later, he received a formal letter inviting him to a public hearing. It was meant to address the community's concerns and discuss reforms to prevent similar incidents. He thought about ignoring it, but something told him that maybe this was his chance to make his pain meaningful. So he went. The hearing was held in a large hall filled with residents, reporters, and officials. Cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking softly. When it was his turn to speak, he walked to the front slowly, his posture straight but calm. He didn't bring notes. He didn't raise his voice. He simply told the truth. He talked about responsibility, about how those who carry authority must remember that every action has weight. He shared how the dog had helped him rebuild his life after war, and how a single thoughtless moment had taken that away. When he finished, the room was silent. Then people began to clap, not loudly, but in a slow, respectful rhythm. Even the officers seated near the front bowed their heads. The chief approached him afterward and quietly said, "We failed you. We failed ourselves too. We'll make this right." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at the man and said, "Make it right for the next one. That's all that matters." After the hearing, the department began introducing new policies, better training on handling animals, community communication guidelines, and emotional awareness programs. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was a start. The story continued to spread across the country. Television hosts discussed it. Animal rights groups reached out. Even former military comrades contacted him, expressing pride in how he had handled it. "You turned pain into purpose," now one of them wrote. Despite all the attention, he remained grounded. He still woke up early, still walked the same path near the lake even if he now walked alone. Sometimes he would pause and imagine the soft sound of paws beside him. It made him smile even through the ache. One morning he found a small package at his doorstep. Inside was a collar, simple brown leather with a note attached. It read, "For your friend who reminded us all of loyalty and love." It had been sent anonymously. He placed it beside the framed photo on his table and felt a warmth spread through his chest. In the following weeks, several news outlets requested television interviews. He declined most of them. He didn't want fame or sympathy. But he agreed to one, a short segment that focused on community healing. During the interview, the host asked him, "What would you want people to learn from all this?" He thought for a moment before answering. "That strength isn't shown through power or reaction," he said. "It's shown through restraint, through understanding, through remembering that every life, human or not, has meaning." The host smiled gently and the segment aired that evening. Viewers described it as powerful and deeply human. Many said it changed how they viewed authority and responsibility. As time passed, the town slowly returned to normal, though some things would never be the same. The man's story had left a quiet mark on everyone who had heard it. Even the officers who had been involved, though no longer serving, had begun volunteering with animal shelters, trying to rebuild what they had lost. For the man himself, peace returned slowly. Not the same peace as before, but a new one shaped by forgiveness and understanding. He knew he could never bring his friend back, but he could honor him by living the way his dog had taught him, with loyalty, patience, and kindness. Sometimes,